Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us on our weekly AJA Zoom event, and welcome to any new people this week. We have people watching on Facebook and around the world, and some who listen to the audio replay, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday and Sundays at 4 p.m. on J-Air Community Radio. That's at FM 88 in Melbourne or j-air.com.au everywhere else. So welcome to you all. My name is Alan Friedman, Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and you will have seen David Adler also, who's President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, Emeritus Professor Ramesh Thakur from the Australian National University. And our topic tonight is the Israel-India relationship, plus a few other things. The format will be an interview slash discussion with Ramesh, and then we'll take questions. And as I always do, if you're new to our system, what we ask you to do is raise your hand electronically if you want to ask a question. The way to do that is in the reaction tab at the bottom. That lets us know that you want to ask a question, and we put you in the line. Written questions can be placed on the chat function, and Robert Gregory, our Director of Public Affairs, will read some of them out during question time as we go. Now, just last Saturday in Israel, President Herzog attended a cultural event at the Israel Museum to inaugurate a new exhibition on Indian sculpture, which he described as a byproduct of the growing friendship between the two countries. We all remember how the friendship took hold with the visit to Israel by Indian PM Narendra Modi a few years ago, but career diplomats are saying that the relationship goes deeper than the personal friendship between the two leaders. As evidence of that, we saw a couple of weeks ago that India abstained on a UN resolution that requested an opinion from the International Court of Justice on Israel's, quote, prolonged occupation of Palestinian territory. We know that Benjamin Netanyahu is returning as Prime Minister, so to expand on what's been happening over the last few years and what the future may look like, we're delighted to be joined tonight by Emeritus Professor Ramesh Thakur from the Australian National University. Ramesh is a Professor of Public Policy and a former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, and is the author of several books on international diplomacy. Ramesh, welcome to the AJA, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Alan, and good evening to everyone.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a few questions, then I'll hand over to David, and about halfway through, we'll throw it open for questions from the audience. Ramesh, President Herzog described India and Israel as natural allies. What do you think he had in mind when he made that comment?
Well, in that speech, he actually stressed the shared democratic values, but there's a lot of stuff that leaders may not necessarily articulate in public. But I think the depth of the relationship, as you intimated, is now a lot deeper than that, and does indeed, in my opinion, in my very firm opinion, transcend whoever might be leader in either country. And this has been growing quite remarkably. Now, just to fill in a bit of my background, I was born in India just after independence and grew up with the prevailing opinions and prejudices against Israel. And I left India in 1971 to go to Canada. And gradually, my views of Israel have evolved. And every time I went back after that, I used to question and criticize Indian foreign policy towards Israel. Indeed, back in '94, I did a book on India's foreign policy, in which I had about 7 pages or 3,000 words on Israel, subtitled India's relations with Israel, neither principled nor pragmatic. Now, I want to expand that because that's important to understand where we've got to today. At one point, as you might gather from that, I've been very strong in some of my opinions throughout my professional life. But at one point, I did say that India's foreign policy, to understand that, you have to remember that India never, but never lets national interests come in the way of its principles. And that was a slightly mischievous thing. But the point of that was, in part, driven by the puzzlement over why, having been one of the first countries to recognize the state of Israel, India was amongst the very great laggards in establishing full ambassadorial relations. That didn't happen until 1992. But since then, the relationship has gone strength to strength across many dimensions, undergirded by democratic values. As far as I can understand, a lot of Israeli youth like to go for R&R to India after their military service. One of the reasons, well, there's two big reasons for that. As you'll know, as all of you will know, India has had many sectarian riots between Hindus and Muslims. I cannot remember a single incident involving Jewish targets of such violence, which are easily sparked in India. The only significant event involving Jewish people or institution in this case was when I think it was called the Chabad House. Forgive me for my pronunciation.
No, that's perfect.
In 2008, when Bombay came under serious attack from Pakistani-based terrorists. That's the first time many of us who don't live in Bombay realized that you had this place in Bombay. And I do remember around that time, or a bit, actually, in the 90s, going to Manchester and reading a student newspaper and being shocked at the vitriol directed by one of the local Muslim writers, equally at Jews, Hindus, and Christians. And against Hindus, the symbol was to do with Kashmir. So that's the first time we discovered that. And aside from that, I said, I can't remember. So there's no tradition or history of hostility towards Jews in India that I can remember, certainly not in my lifetime, and even historically. And they have been present for a very long time. So that's one reason. A second interesting reason is that it's one of the very few countries where Jews can go and explain their ritual prohibition on food. And Hindus say, oh, yes, we have the same thing, we understand exactly. Just tell us what's prohibited and we'll work around it. So that makes it very comfortable. And that's, there's not that many countries, even now as things begin to heat up again against Jewish communities, where they can feel reasonably safe and comfortable and secure without having to worry about these. And now remember, this is in a country that at the moment has 200 Muslims. And yet there have not been incidents even against Jews. So there's all those as background factor. There's scope for cooperation on defense. I'm not sure how many of your audience today realize that India is Israel's biggest defense export market. 43% currently, or in the last 5 years, of Israel's total arms exports have gone to India. From India's point of view, Israel is the third biggest supplier after Russia, which is a legacy issue, then France, and then Israel. So Israel supplies more to India than the United States, which is quite remarkable.
Right.
There's that aspect. There's science and technology. There's agricultural cooperation. I believe whatever your international development cooperation ministry is called, one of their 6 water experts is actually stationed in India, I believe. It's the only foreign country in which they do such a thing. So there's scope on all that. And of course, security cooperation in the anti-terrorism front. And the perception in Israel that Israel has its Gaza problem, India has its Kashmir problem. I think there is understanding of each other's constraints. So you mentioned India's abstention on the Israeli factor, but India also abstained on an Iran resolution. And there wasn't a criticism from Israel. And finally, in recent years, you had, of course, the Modi government, which has invested a lot in building relations with Israel, while also, interestingly, building relations with some of the Arab countries in the region. So I think it has gone from strength to strength. There's recognition that we share a lot of interests, but don't necessarily pursue all policies in harmony, and we understand each other's constraints. And that speaks well for a maturity in the relationship, which I'm very pleased to be relatively new. So that was a long answer, but I hope it gives you some sense.
No. Very interesting. I was interested in something that you mentioned, and you said that back in the early days, India had a natural prejudice against Israel. Where did this come from? I mean, India and Israel were formed sort of roughly around the same time.
1947, 48, absolutely.
So where did this prejudice against Israel come from?
That's a very interesting question. I think one root of that lay in pre-independence Indian National Congress Party, which was the ruling party for several decades, which had sympathies towards the Arabs for historical reasons. I think as a party that led India's struggle for independence, there was great suspicion of and resentment towards Britain imposing, as the then leadership believed, the state of Israel against the wishes of the Palestinian people, whose majority situation gradually diminished. I think there was the desire to quote the number of Arab votes as against a solitary Israeli vote in the United Nations. And it took some decades before India's disenchantment with the United Nations doesn't quite match Israel's, but it's a lot closer to that than used to be the case. And I think, of course, sensitivity towards India's own Muslim population. So all these factors came together, and it expressed itself sometimes in really a very petty ways. I remember once the Jerusalem Orchestra was due to perform in Bombay, and the Indian government said, well, Jerusalem is an internationally disputed city, and if you want to perform in Bombay, you have to drop the name. So the orchestra dropped Bombay from its itinerary instead. And at times, India's Davis Cup team was not allowed to go and play in Israel. Indian films were not allowed to be exhibited in Israel. Film directors were not allowed to go to take part or collect their awards and stuff like that. So it was very petty in those ways. But when it changed, and the Indian people were given an idea of the underlying depth and breadth of friendship, and the ways in which for all the courtship of the Arab and Islamic countries, when it mattered, they had preferred to side with Pakistan sometimes on Kashmir rather than India. I think gradually that began to change. And then the whole terrorism phenomenon. I think that brought a measure of sympathy towards Israel that India had not had before. And so one of my bucket lists is that I've never managed to get to Israel. When the invitations have come, I haven't been able to go. Now I have the time. I hope at some point I will fulfill that. But so I don't know what the Israeli sentiment is about India in terms of terrorism. But remember, outside of Israel, India has been a frontline state against cross-border terrorism for very many years. And the numbers involved for a long time were truly horrific. And this is not just, by the way, restricted to Kashmir.
Yes, yes. Now, I read a few days ago that Israel expressed a desire to invest in Uttar Pradesh. Can you tell us what this is all about?
Well, I don't know what sector they're talking about, but Uttar Pradesh is India's most populous state. You're talking about a state that has a population of 200 million. So if it was an independent country, it would be one of the biggest countries in the whole world. It is also an incredibly underdeveloped state. It's right in the center. It's the Hindi heartland of India. It's also, because of its population weight, the political heartland of India. So I haven't, as I've seen what this particular one is. I know there is a lot of interest in, again, high-tech defense cooperation. If you remember the incidents with Pakistan 3 years ago in early 2019, it was Israeli missiles that the Indian Air Force fired deep into Pakistan, and they've been replenished since then. I think there's a lot of scope for Israeli investment in Indian agriculture, which tends to be quite primitive in some respects in the use of technology. I haven't seen this particular report that you're referring to. I just came back from India. At that time, there was a controversy over a particular film festival, but that's a different issue.
Okay. And you did mention that there's a lot of Israeli tourism to India. I think it's about 40,000 Israelis visit annually, often after completing their military service. But the interesting thing is that in places like Goa, there are actually Hebrew signs on businesses and public transport and other places like that. Has this this is quite an interesting tourism phenomenon. Has this happened with any other cultures that you're aware of?
No, I think I mean, India has been historically a hospitable country for most people who've come. But this is something new. But also remember, in Kerala, in Fort Cochin, I think you have one of the longest surviving and still functioning synagogues in the world, certainly in the Commonwealth. And my one complaint against Israel is that the year that my wife and I went to that place and we wanted to go in, we were barred from entry because your president was visiting. The synagogue was closed. So that's one complaint against Israel, but I can live with that.
Okay. All right, David, I'll hand back to you and you can fire a couple of questions at Ramesh.
Okay. Thank you, Ramesh. It seems to me that a commonality of values as well as security issues is what's driving the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Israel has some threats on its borders and has had. India has two countries that some in the world see as problematic, Pakistan and China.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been some border tensions with both those countries. Can you just tell us a very little bit about the situation on the borders?
Sure. You have two very long borders. Both are contested. One with China is a problem left over from history between the British, Indian, and Chinese territories, where lines were drawn somewhat arbitrarily. And of course, every country has a tendency to claim the maximum territory that was under its jurisdiction at some point in the past. Invariably, then the claims overlap. The reason that remains an issue is not so much the historical claims themselves, but the fact that some of these territories are asymmetrically important for the strategic defense of either India or China. And that makes it difficult to work out an arrangement. There are three different sectors. The most sensitive is the northern sector, because that's where Pakistan and China and India intersect and their claims overlap. And there's a fear in Indian security circles of a two-front collusion. The northeast Indian sector is sensitive because of tribal politics there, and also the fact that there's a chicken's neck issue there, in the sense that there's one narrow strip, and the Chinese came through, they could cut northeast India part off from the rest of India. However, by and large, it's remained a problem that's dormant rather than active. And 2 years ago, in the valley in Galwan, back in the Himalayas, was the deadliest clashes in 45 years for the first time. Surprised everyone. The reassuring thing about that was, even there, I mean, these are two nuclear armed countries, but they're fighting literally with sticks and stones. The nuclear issue was not raised by either side. That is not true with Pakistan. In Pakistan, and incidentally, that's another common element. India is a country, you will find that is a long time since it criticized, shall we say, alleged or believed nuclear weapon capability by Israel. India keeps quiet on that. Of the three countries that have never signed the NPT, you have India, Israel as one, India as the second, and Pakistan as the third. But Pakistan raises the nuclear flashpoint issue simply as a means of trying to internationalize, and it's India that tries to downplay that. With the Pakistan, the problem, in a sense, one element, I mean, the articulation of that is territorial, dispute over Kashmir status. Had it again been purely a territorial issue, I think it would have been solved a long time ago. The problem essentially is this: Kashmir is crucial to the national identity of both Pakistan and India, but in competitive terms. Pakistan was created as the homeland for the subcontinent's Muslims. Therefore, if a Muslim majority state remains part of India, that negates the very idea of Pakistan. By contrast, India was created as a secular state. It has never been a Hindu republic. And if the only Muslim majority state were to leave and join Pakistan because of its Muslim identity, it undermines the notion of India as a secular republic.
Right, I understand.
Believe you me, I have had conversations with Indian Muslims who are much more hardline against Kashmir being let go than I am, because you're talking about only 15 million maximum in Kashmir, who, if they were to leave India, would jeopardize the remaining 190 million Muslims left behind in India. So they're very sensitive on that issue. Muslims are spread all over the country. They're not geographically concentrated anywhere. So that's that issue there. And then it goes from that to the fact that India has thrived as a democratic country. Pakistan, for most of the time, or for half the time, has been ruled overtly by the military. And the rest of the time, the military remains the most powerful institution in the country, much more powerful than parties, and in some ways controls security policy and key elements of foreign policy. So that factor is also a relevant factor in that sense. Similarly, just to complete this, although it's not in relation to China and Pakistan, India and Israel have also been united in opposing international attempts to try and impose a nuclear weapon-free zone in their respective regions. So the more I talk, you can see that there's a lot of historical depth to the common values. And finally, one final point. Given the way the world has gone in terms of the rise of autocracies and the tensions and conflicts between them, I look forward to the day when we can have an arc of democratic countries from North America to Europe to Israel in the Middle East, taking in India in South Asia, taking in Japan in East Asia, and coming south to Australia as well. I think that will be a very powerful coalition of like-minded and, more importantly, like-value countries. And that could be an important coalition, even if it's formal.
Ramesh, that actually is a perfect introduction for the other subject I want to touch on before we go into open questions.
Mm-hmm.
You have had a senior position in the United Nations Secretariat as Assistant Secretary General. Can you say a little bit about that role? And then I'll ask you a couple of things about the UN itself.
Sure. Well, I had 2 or 3 roles. My main role was as the Senior Vice Director of the United Nations University, which is headquartered in Tokyo. And we have, at that time, we had 14 institutes around the world. The nearest one to Israel would have been a leadership academy in Amman in Jordan. I was also the principal writer of Kofi Annan's second reform report in 2002. And I did that. And then I was responsible for liaison with the United Nations or the UN University. And Kofi asked me, and I co-organized and co-chaired an annual meeting in Geneva of the main parts of the main research wings of the UN system and the counterparts in the consuming side, the natural consumers of the research produced by these institutions. So I did have a senior position, and that meant I was involved in some respects with the top leadership as well. But most of my work was in relation to the academic world that the UN University, which was working with universities, other universities.
Yeah. Well, are you able to comment on what we certainly see as an extraordinary obsession and anti-Israel bias in a number of the UN forums, whether it's the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council and others? What do you think is going on there?
It's partly historical legacy because of the similar factors to what I explained about India. I think for the broader international community, the 2 big emotional issues to which many countries were attached was the issue of apartheid in South Africa and the Palestinian cause in the Middle East. I think the not simultaneous but close enough emergence of South Africa from its apartheid era and the contrast between Nelson Mandela as a leader and Yasser Arafat taking over in the Palestine or the PLO has gradually diminished the attractiveness of the Palestinian cause, but not entirely erased it. I think there is a reluctance to be seen to be rewarding the expansion of Israel's territorial borders as a result of the use of force. I think one of the worst and most scandalous events in the history of the United Nations was that resolution equating Zionism with racism. I think there was general relief and considerable silent applause when that was rescinded in due course. I think there is resentment at the extent to which Israel, as a non-major power, is able to challenge and ignore a number of resolutions. And that imbalance of protection provided by and cover provided by the United States and Western countries in the Security Council finds expression in the obsession with Israel, almost to a greater extent than all other countries combined in the Human Rights Council. I think the thing to remember about the United Nations is it's two things. It's an idea that expresses the notion and concept of human solidarity transcending countries and cultures and religions. And because people still believe in that, they sometimes fall into the trap of identifying that with the existing structures and procedures and decisions. The second lot of decisions and procedures, you have to remember the United Nations is first and foremost a political organization. Justice and perceptions of justice rarely are decisive in how countries vote on any issue. What the Security Council decides reflects a particular combination of membership of the Council at the time, the weight of the permanent members, and the extent to which they're prepared to pursue a particular topic. So there, as I said, I think Israel is protected by the United States first and then some of the others. In the Human Rights Council, on the other hand, when we changed from the previous organization to the Human Rights Council, I remember saying at the time, if it was to become influential, then given the way it is going to be, its membership is going to be selected, the countries which are the problem countries will make sure they get on.
That's right.
That also happens. And just to finish that off, I think we have to remember the problem is we all want the United Nations to be active and assertive against others, but not against us. So we want the United Nations to ensure that there is a minimum standards of human rights, that torture is not just proscribed, but those who engage in torture are identified and penalized. But look what happens when the committee wants to come to Australia.
Yes, indeed.
Please stay away. India has done that. Israel has done that. I think finally, again on that, one of the things that India can learn from Israel is to downplay the importance of the United Nations. I think people get hung up with numbers and get mesmerized by numbers. The numbers of votes doesn't reflect the political and diplomatic weight, even in the UN system, that some countries command. On the other hand, I think India has always been an influential member. And that's something, the fact that India abstained on this resolution, that's something that has opportunities for further collaboration later on, where India can be useful in downplaying and negating some of the hostility that exists in various parts of the UN system.
Ramesh, one final question from me. The largest voting bloc in the UN is the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, the Muslim countries, 56 votes in the General Assembly. We see on the numbers, the influence being quite significant. And if you want support on something you're doing, it's better to appease than to block the largest voting segment there. Is that overstating it? How significant is the OIC in the United Nations?
I don't think it's overstating it. I think you have to be careful that you don't overstate the impact of that in terms of the actual results. That's where I said I think numbers in the end don't really matter. I mean, you know, when the Indian Army went into Bangladesh in 1971, all majority of the countries, including pretty much all the Western countries, were heavily critical of something that today would be applauded as an early example of humanitarian intervention. And at that time, it is the then Soviet Union that protected India in the Security Council. So again, there's a history to why India is reluctant to start criticizing Russia on things today. So that aspect is there. I think it's, you know, if you look at various things like celebrating religious holidays or protection of particular religions, there's no doubt that the OIC influence is much greater than that of any other religion. But again, if you want to extend the larger thing to the UN system, there are parts of the UN system that operate quite autonomously. I mean, when I was with the UN University, I organized 2 companion projects after the Iraq War, one looking at the arms control implications of what had happened, and the other more normative issues. Because we are dealing with the region, in each, I had invited one Israeli participant from Israel to the thing. Close to the meeting dates, I suddenly started getting messages from some of the Arab participants in both the different projects saying that the government was asking if there were going to be any Israelis, and if there were, they could not participate. So could I please respond? So I went back and said, yes, there are some, as long as Israel is a member state in good standing. It is in the region. I'm talking about the region. They are very welcome. And if the person who had written to me couldn't attend, I would regret it. But in that case, I would like them to pass on a message from me to the government, which was, I have a meeting on the Middle East, an Israeli voice would be heard, your voice will be absent by your choice. Who do you think benefits from that? So I made sure the Israelis came. They chose not to come. That was their decision. I'll give you another example. I won't mention the country concerned, but you can make your own guesses. We were looking to establish a new institute on energy security in the region. And the way we operated, we would have an endowment fund of, at that time, $40 million to be provided by the host country. Negotiations had gone very well. For the final round of discussions, I went myself to the country concerned, and we were meeting with various groups, and in the end, with the minister. And the question came up, if you had applicants for the directorship of the institute who were from Israel, what would you do? And I answered that, well, at the moment, we didn't have any Israeli director. It was the member state in good standing. If the Israeli person was the best person, we would welcome that. In particular, if that happened to be a woman. And the answer was, well, women would be a second problem area for us because we are in this region. So we actually fell apart on that issue. And I said, well, I'm sorry, as long as I'm with the UN University, it will not proceed on these grounds of a preemptive veto of someone by nationality and gender. And so we let it go. And I went back and explained why I had done that. And there was absolutely no pushback against my decision made on the spot. So I think there are people within the system who recognize the problems that Israel has had and try to do what they can to redress that if they can.
Okay. Thank you so much. We're ready to open up for questions, or should I do the 1 minute?
Yes, let's do the your 1 minute commercial. Then we've got a couple of hands up, so I was going to mention to people, now's the time to put your hand up if you want to. We'll hear from David, and just before I go to the audience, I've just got a couple of questions of my own. So take it away, David.
Okay. Well, as we always do, we need the tangible support of everyone to get behind AJA. If you're not yet a member, after this event, please go to jewishassociation.org.au, where you can join, you can make a donation. Make sure you like and follow the Facebook page, which is the largest Jewish platform in the country now. And we do have the tax-deductible arm, AJA Tzedakah. which has the primary objective of fighting anti-Semitism, and I'll put the account number in the chat in a moment, and any donation in that direction is tax deductible. Next week, we have someone who's known as being a supercharged Israel advocate, ex-Aussie David Lang. He runs the organisation Israeli Cool and uses some extraordinary strategies to support the state of Israel. We'll hear from him directly next week.
Thanks, David. We'll go to questions in a moment, but Ramesh, just before we do, and I've been very interested to hear you talk about the United Nations. Let me ask you this: what does the United Nations do that benefits mankind? And I guess I'm just being partially tongue-in-cheek here.
No, it's a fair question. I think a lot of the operational side of it and the humanitarian delivery side of it are generally appreciated, not always and not in every instance, but generally. I think it's the failure on the Security Council front where, from my point of view, too many people mistake the decisions of member states as decisions by UN staff. UN staff are international civil servants. Decisions on policy decisions and operational decisions are made mainly by member states. And it is still the case that the single most powerful member state and the single most influential member state is the United States. And in matters that are heavyweight geopolitical issues, the most powerful bloc is still the Western bloc, whereas in numbers, it becomes the OIC and then some of the others. So I think we should try and differentiate in those aspects as well. And incidentally, some of the strongest pro-Israeli American ambassadors, or one of the strongest pro-Israeli American ambassadors, was of course a lady of Indian descent, Nikki Haley.
That's right. Yes. And you mentioned almost talking about a coalition of democratic countries. Mm-hmm. That's actually being thought of, and they've tried to do that sort of thing, haven't they? Basically as a replacement for the United Nations. Do you think that's ever got any chance of getting off the ground?
I don't think I would support it as a replacement for the United Nations. I think there is benefit to having... Look, the United Nations is the only body that houses all the divided fragments of humanity. And there is symbolic importance to that. On a practical working level, however, I think there's a lot to be said for moving ahead with informal coalitions and caucuses of countries that share similar values and attitudes to world affairs and similar commitments to world based on law and justice rather than brute force and politics.
Okay, we'll go to questions. We'll start with Jason, then we'll take Robert and Leon. So Jason, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, good evening, sir, and thank you for being here tonight. I listened with great interest to your comments on the arc of democracy and in particular, the legacy issue that India has with reliance on Russian military equipment. Mm-hmm. So my question is that, given that the UN is inept when it comes to dealing with Russia and China, to what degree is the Indian legacy reliance on Russian equipment a spur to greater overt engagement with Israel and the West?
That's been happening anyway. I think the demonstration of the poor quality of Russian arms in Ukraine is not going to make too many Indians enamored of getting more Russian arms. But essentially, over the past 5 to 10 years, India has been trying to diversify. And the reason that France and Israel are number 2 and 3 rather than the United States is that India doesn't have that great a happy history of arms deliveries from the United States. They have gone, India has been the victims of the use of American arms supply to Pakistan in the past. No Indian government in the foreseeable future is going to forget that. And then another problem with American supplies is that when you have a war, they'll put a freeze on. So they're happy to arm you until the time that you actually need the arms, and then they'll stop. Well, that's not very helpful. And the shock of the USS Enterprise sailing into the Bay of Bengal in 1971 in the Bangladesh War was a major factor behind India's decision to go down the nuclear path. Later on, China became the primary object, and it was never a factor in relation to Pakistan because it actually helps Pakistan rather than India in that bilateral relationship. The commitment to strategic autonomy by India is, let me put it this way, about as strong as Israel's determination, for reasons of its history, never to rely for its security and the security of its people on anyone else in the future. That to the maximum extent possible, it will depend on itself. If others support, well and good. If not, it will still try and do it on its own. So that similar thing exists in India as well. I think the fact that India now has a majority government for the second term running and is likely to retain that in the future gives it a position of authority in internal decision making that has been lacking for 30 years. And coalition governments, I think Israelis know that even better than India, coalition governments impose their own constraints on decision making.
Okay, Robert, our Director of Public Affairs, must have some questions. So please unmute yourself, Robert. Thanks.
Thanks, Ramesh. Yeah, just a few questions we've got. So one of the biggest security challenges for Israel is Iran and Iran's nuclear weapons program. What's India's position on that, and does it view it as a risk to the region? And also Pakistan, it's not often spoken about, but they have a lot of nuclear weapons and quite an unstable government. What are your thoughts on, some other regime taking over Pakistan, Islamic radicals having access to all these nuclear weapons?
Pakistan's nukes is a bigger security nightmare to India than to any other country in the world. I don't know how many of you are aware, but essentially Pakistan's nukes, when it got them, were China's nukes. If you go back to 1998, India tests in early May, Pakistan tests in late May. I don't believe even the United States today has this technical capacity to decide today that it wants to conduct tests and be able to carry out within 2 weeks. The reason Pakistan was able to do that was essentially there were Chinese bombs that were tested on Pakistani soil. Indian establishment believes that the first bombs for Pakistan were tested on Chinese soil around 1990 or so. Pakistan developed its nuclear capability with massive Chinese help on a number of fronts. And in some cases, there was a relationship between Pakistan and North Korea via China as well. I simply do not buy the claim that Chinese were completely unaware of this. That's simply not credible. So there is that factor also. Iran, on the other hand, if you go back to, again, recent history, the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan that was fighting the Taliban government, the government that hosted Osama bin Laden and looked the other way as they prepared for their attack on United States on 9/11. That Northern Alliance was kept alive by active collaboration, or if not collaboration, certainly mutually reinforcing policies by India, Russia, and Iran. Iran has major problems with Pakistan as well because they share a border on the other side. So you're going back to very old-fashioned geopolitical factors that the enemy of your enemy is potentially an ally. And there's other factors also. The reality, see, India has distinguished between Iran as a non-Arab and other countries in the Middle East as Arabs as well. So again, there's that factor. Then the Indian dependence on energy supplies and Iran being a major supplier, that's been a factor. So there's lots of reasons why India has hesitated to join the international condemnations and criticism of Iran. On the other hand, I think on statements on Iran's nuclear capability, Indians have not been ambiguous on that. Once India crossed the nuclear threshold itself, it joined all the other countries with nuclear weapons in saying no one else must be allowed to cross again, and it became committed to non-proliferation. So in that sense, it became as hypocritical as every other country that has the bomb. And that's not surprising either, that's the way things go. So, I mean, the final factor is India has been very reluctant to engage in international preaching in recent times, and appreciative of each country has to make its own decisions based on its security calculations. Let us do what we want, and you do what you want, so long as it doesn't impinge on our interests.
Yes, just on the, I was trying to think whether when we have our cricket season here in summer, whether India and Pakistan are actually both here at the same time, because I was wondering what sort of relationship does India have with Pakistan? Is it completely hostile?
At the government-to-government level, it is. There's several reasons for that. I think, you know, you had that experience in Israel as well, where you made peace gestures once in a while, and they've been misunderstood as signs of weakness, perhaps, and spurned and rejected or taken advantage of. This has happened with India as well, where Manmohan Singh, when he was Prime Minister, made certain statements and agreed to certain things, and that was exploited by Pakistan, and that undercut Manmohan Singh in his Pakistan policy in domestic politics quite dramatically. It happened with Vajpayee before him, when he made gestures towards Pakistan, and while the civilian government was happy to reciprocate, the military in the meantime launched this surprise stealth attack in Kargil in 1999, which, as far as we can tell, the civilian government was not even aware of, let alone had approved. So that was undermined then. Modi himself, you may remember in his first term very early on the way back from Afghanistan, made a surprise day tour, landed in Lahore to help Nawaz Sharif celebrate, I think it was his daughter's birthday. And again, that was seen as a sign of weakness or desperation, and they did certain things which left Modi feeling we can't trust them, and I'm not going to trust them for the future until things change. The relationship between the civilians and the military seems to be under stress in Pakistan. If that were to change, and you had the emergence of a civilian government, then the potential for the timing to agree in both countries might come about. For India, the bigger problem, I think, is if Modi doesn't rein in the militant Hindutva elements of the Indian population, which has grown more militant because of perception, mostly justified in my opinion, that the previous Congress governments had been far too prone to appeasement of minority views and demands by Muslims. In a country where you can ban polygamy for Hindus, but you don't ban it for Muslims, even though there's only a tiny minority of Muslims that actually engage in the practice, it feeds public hostility and resentment.
Sure.
Modi is the first prime minister who's actually gone to celebrate major Hindu festivals in a temple. Previous governments thought that would be a violation of India's commitment to secularism. So it was bizarre that in a Hindu majority country, a Hindu prime minister felt unable to go to a temple to celebrate a major Hindu festival. So those sorts of things built up a lot of resentment. And I think they have to separate a justified redressing of the balance in treating the different communities and reining in virulent anti-Muslim sentiment. Because if the latter is allowed to reign, to just proliferate, you can't control the resulting problems and difficulties, not with 200 million Muslims spread all over the country. So that's the balance that they have to take. They're trying to do that. I think they're discovering that what happens within India doesn't stay inside India. It has foreign policy implications. The Modi government has taken a lot of pride in the way it has cultivated some Muslim countries in the Middle East and detached them from Pakistan in the OIC, in the UN. They're not going to jeopardize that. So now, for the first time, they're coming down hard on party spokesmen who make irresponsible statements in public.
Yeah, it almost sounds like the Modi government and Narendra Modi is something of a visionary in terms of Indian politics. Is that a reasonable observation?
It is. I think he has failed to deliver on some respects. There are times when he's been impetuous rather than visionary and bold and decisive. But those things will work out. I still think, as things stand, he's the best option for India.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, Leon, we'll take your question. You've been waiting a while, so please unmute and ask your question.
Good evening, sir. How widespread in India is the awareness that the Jewish people are actually the indigenous people of the land of Israel?
I don't think there would be much awareness of that. In a sense, that's the price you're paying for the good history of lack of problems with the Jews, and they're not a sizable minority in India. And therefore, most people are unaware of that factor and the historical situation in the Middle East. I suspect if this could be introduced into the educational curricula, or it became part of media coverage more on a more regular basis, that might change. Certainly, it is my case that, as I said, my views about Israel and India's relationship began to change after I left in 1971. And whenever I went back, I used to have conversations and point things out. And that would come as a big surprise to most people, that this was India's official policy vis-a-vis Israel, and that it had been damaging to India in certain important quarters, and not just in Israel, but in Western countries, without gaining any material assistance or benefits in other quarters. And they would then start thinking, well, this needs to change. So gradually, I think that awareness came there. But I don't think most will be aware of the complicated of Israel things. But one final thing on that, even for someone like me, as a well-educated person in India, the other thing that most Indians cannot grasp at all is how it was possible for the Holocaust to have happened. There's no doubting the Holocaust. I mean, they take that, but they just find it utterly incomprehensible, which I think results from the fact that there has not been ever any anti-Jewish sentiment in India.
I suspect Leon's question may have come from when you were talking about India's traditional view of the Middle East, and I was thinking it really sounds like they've bought into the Arab narrative and not really become familiar with the Jewish narrative of the area. So it sounds as if
I think that will be true. Yeah.
And so am I hearing that this is now starting to change?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I think that your embassy and consulates do a great job on that. I mean, let me go back to the film festival controversy that I mentioned earlier, because I found it interesting as a professional student of diplomacy. What happened was there's an international Indian film festival in Goa, of course, where there's a very large number of Jewish tourists. And the chair of the jury was Nadav Lapid, an Israeli filmmaker. Is that name correct? And at the end of that, he mentioned a new film in India that I hadn't heard of before, called the Kashmir Files, which is about an ethnic expulsion of Kashmiri Hindus by the Muslims during phase of militancy in the 90s and early 2000s. It was presented for consideration of an award in a creative, artistic category I don't really follow all those, so I don't know. But the chairman made comments saying this was a vulgar propaganda film in the context of the award for which it was submitted. That was taken as an attack, a political attack on the reality of what had happened. And the embassy started getting massive blowback on social media. So the ambassador actually sent a long open letter by tweet to the director saying, you are now back in Israel. In future, can you please ensure that you restrict your criticism to Israeli policies? We can deal with that internally. This is a foreign policy matter. You made your statement in India. You've gone back. My team is now having to deal with the consequences of that. And we are suddenly, for the first time, seeing social media people saying, well, shall we start saying that the Holocaust never happened? What about Schindler's Ark? Was that just fictional account? Stuff like that. It was a long tweet, which the foreign ministry then retweeted. So it was an interesting response in terms of diplomacy, where the ambassador to India is openly criticizing an Israeli film director in a cultural context. But it was just reflective of the sensitivity.
Yes.
That is an internal guardrail, if you like, for Indians. And there is a complex history to that as well. So don't start getting involved in that. I think that's not a bad line for any Israeli to take in India, saying, look, you have your Kashmir issue, we have our issues with the Palestinians, both have a complex history behind that. Before you become judgmental, could you please give us the courtesy of listening to our narrative? And I think you will find that there are a lot more receptive to that line than a hardline defensiveness, because I think most Indians' position would be based on lack of knowledge rather than a carefully thought out hostility. Because once you start explaining, I'm sure most will realize that there's a lot more that binds Indians and Israelis than divides them, even on these contentious issues.
Yeah, sure. Moish, will take your question. That will be the last. And so please mute yourself and ask your question.
In northeast India, there are been emerging for a long time people who claim that they are descendants of Jews who were exiled about 2,800, 2,500 years ago from Israel, from the land of Israel to there, and they're wanting to rejoin the Jewish nation. Now, they do come and they do convert under religious law here in Israel, but I'm not sure if what I'm saying is correct, because it seems that there may be some restrictions in them being able to go through a conversion process to become Jewish in India. Are you familiar with that situation at all?
No, I'm not even familiar with the background to that. Northeast India? Which part of Northeast India would they be claiming?
Near the Burmese border, I believe.
That's the first time.
Myanmar border.
Yeah, no. As I said, there's a significant Jewish community still in Kerala and in Western India. For historical reasons, it was a C2C communication. I think there is a lot of sensitivity about Hindus converting to Islam for obvious reasons. There is sensitivity about Hindus converting to Christianity because of the activities of missionaries. This is the first time I've heard that there is any problem with them trying to convert to Judaism. So I can't answer that. This is new to me, so I'm afraid I can't answer that.
Okay. On that note, we'll need to wrap it up. We've been speaking with Ramesh Thakur, Emeritus Professor from the Australian National University. Ramesh, thank you so much for joining us. What I got from the way you spoke was the need to have a balance of all the intricacies between, in international diplomacy. And look, yes, we probably do tend to take a bit of a black and white view of things, but it was very interesting just hear how an international diplomat looks at the situation. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for your time. And it's been a pleasure listening to you. Thank you for joining us.
As a final comment, I would suggest, if it's not already happening, that there would be scope for an annual Indo-Israeli strategic dialogue where you bring together some members of the elite from across academia and media and some retired diplomats, if you like, and meet alternately in Israel and India and get them talking to each other, and they can feed through the respective narratives to a broader population.
Yes,
So
yes.
they might look at.
Yes, absolutely. We should be pushing for that. Ramesh, thank you so much. Just before we go, the L'chaim program with Morris Klein is on right now. It's on 3ZZZ FM 92.3 or 3ZZZ.com.au. And Morris has got Senator Simon Birmingham, the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, and I imagine that will be a very interesting discussion. That's all we have for tonight. Don't forget, next week we have David Lang, the man behind the Israeli Cool blog site. You can keep up to date with what the AJA is doing by following our Facebook page, so please like it and share it widely. But for now, we wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you next week as usual. So from me, it's good night to you all. Bye, everyone.